Hello, bros. We're back with Perfume by Patrick Suskind. The story of a murderer. He's also got our friend Dirty Bastard here with us. He's going to usher us in to the reading. Probably shouldn't pour over the cup. This stuff is very rich. And quite potent. Quite the potent drink. Very good. All right. I guess I do have my bookmark in there. Start reading, bruv. 26. The sign for these debaucheries was, how could it be otherwise, the innermost empire, where he had buried the husks of every odor encountered since birth. To enhance the mood, he first conjured up those that were earliest and most remote. The hostile, steaming vapors of Madame Galliard's bedroom, the bone-dry, leathery bouquet of her hands, the vinegary breath of Father Terrier, the hysterical, hot maternal sweat of Bussy, or is it Busey, the wet nurse, the carrion stench of the Cimetière des Innocents, the homicidal odor of his mother, and he wallowed in disgust and loathing, and his hair stood on end at the delicious horror. Sometimes, if this repulsive aperitif did not quite get him into stride, he would allow himself a brief odoriferous detour to Grimal's for a whiff of the stench of raw, meaty skins and tanning broths, or he imagined the collective effluvium of 600,000 Parisians in the sultry, oppressive heat of late summer. And then, all at once, the pent-up hate would erupt with orgasmic force. That was, after all, the point of the exercise. Like a thunderstorm, he rolled across these odors that had dared offend his patrician nose. He thrashed at them as hail thrashes a grain field, like a hurricane. He scattered the rabble and drowned them in a grand, purifying deluge of distilled water. And how just was his anger! How great his revenge! Ah, what a sublime moment! Grenouilla, the little man, quivered with excitement. His body writhed with voluptuous delight, and arched so high that he slammed his head against the roof of the tunnel, only to sink back slowly and lie there, lolling in satiation. Bless me. It really was too pleasant, this volcanic act that extinguished all obnoxious odors. Really too pleasant. This was almost his favorite routine in the whole repertoire of his innermost universal theater, for it imparted to him the wonderful sense of righteous exhaustion that comes after only truly grand heroic deeds. Now he could rest awhile in good conscience. He stretched out to the extent his body fit within the narrow stony quarters. Deep inside, however, on the cleanly swept mats of his soul, he stretched out comfortably to the fullest and dozed away, letting delicate scents play about his nose, a spicy gust, for instance, as if borne here from springtime meadows, a mild May wind wafting through the first green leaves of beech, a sea breeze with the bitterness of salted almonds. It was late afternoon when he arose, something like late afternoon, for naturally there was no afternoon or forenoon or evening or morning. There was neither light nor darkness, nor were there spring meadows nor green beech leaves. What's up, bruvs? There were no real things at all in Grenouilla's innermost universe, only the odor of things which is why the Fachon de I don't know how to say that, speaks of that universe as a landscape, an adequate expression, to be sure, but the only possible one since our language is of no use when it comes to describing the smellable world. Hello, bruvs. It was then, late afternoon, that is, a condition and moment within Granuia's soul such as reigns over the south when the siesta is done and the paralysis of midday slowly recedes, and life's urge begins again after such constraint. The heat kindled by rage, the enemy of sublime sense, had fled. The pack of demons was annihilated. The fields within him lay soft and burnished beneath the lascivious peace of his awakening, and they waited for the will of their Lord to come upon them. And Granuia rose up, as noted, and shook the sleep from his limbs. He stood up, the great innermost Granuia, like a giant, he planted himself in all his glory and grandeur. Hello, bruvs. Hello. Achu, bless you. Splendid to look upon, damn shame that no one saw him and looked about him, proud and majestic. Yes, this was his empire, the incomparable empire of Granuia, created and ruled over by him, the incomparable Granuia, laid waste by him if he so chose, and then raised up again, made boundless by him, and defended with a flaming sword against every intruder. Here there was naught but his will, the will of the great, splendid, incomparable Granuia. And now that the evil stench of the past had been swept away, he desired that his empire be fragrant, and with mighty strides he passed across the fallow fields and sowed fragrance of all kinds, wastefully here, sparingly there, in plantations of endless dimension, and in small, intimate parcels, strewing seeds by the fistful or tucking them in one by one in selected spots. To the farthermost regions of his empire, Granuia the Great, the frantic gardener, hurried, and soon there was not a cranny left into which he had not thrown a seed of fragrance. And when he saw that it was good, and that the whole earth was saturated with his divine Granuia seeds, then Granuia the Great let descend a shower of rectified spirit, soft and steady, and everywhere and over all the seed began to germinate and sprout, bringing forth shoots to gladden his heart. On the plantation it rolled in luxurious waves, and in the hidden garden the stems stood full with sap. The blossoms all but exploded from their buds. Then Granuia the Great commanded the rain to stop, and it was so. And he sent the gentle sun of his smile upon the land, whereupon to a bud the host of blossoms unfolded their glory from one end of his empire unto the other, creating a single rainbowed carpet woven from myriad precious capsules of fragrance. And Granuia the Great saw that it was good, very, very good, and he caused the wind of his breath to blow across the land. And he caused the wind of his breath. Oh, wait. And the blossoms, thus caressed, spilled over with scent and intermingled their teeming scents into one constantly changing scent that in all its variety was nevertheless merged into the odor of universal homage to him, Granuia the Great, the incomparable, the magnificent, who, enthroned upon his gold scented cloud, sniffed his breath back in again, and the sweet savor of the sacrifice was pleasing unto him. And he deigned to bless his creation several times over, from whom came thanksgiving with songs of praise and rejoicing, and yet further outpourings of glorious fragrance. Meanwhile, evening was come, and the sun spilled over still, and united with the blue of night to form ever more fantastic airs. A veritable gala of scent awaited, with one gigantic burst of fragrant diamond studded fireworks. Granuia the Great, however, had tired a little, and yawned and spoke. Behold, I have done a great thing, and I am well pleased. But as with all the works once finished, it begins to bore me. I shall withdraw, and to crown this strenuous day, I shall allow myself yet one more small delectation in the chambers of my heart. Yeah, I know it does. Only because I looked up the pronunciation of Granouilla. So spoke Granouilla the Great, and, while the peasantry of Scent danced and celebrated beneath him, he glided with wide stretched wings down from his golden clouds across the nocturnal fields of his soul and home to his heart. And there's a home right there. 27. Ah, returning home was pleasant. The double role of Avenger and Creator of Worlds was not a little taxing, and then to be celebrated afterwards for hours on end by one's own offspring was not the perfect way to relax either. Weary of the duties of divine creator and official host, Granouilla the Great longed for some small domestic bliss. His heart was a purple castle. It lay in a rock strewn desert, concealed by dunes, surrounded by a marshy oasis, and sat behind stone walls. It could be reached only from the air. It had 1,000 private rooms and 1,000 underground chambers and 1,000 elegant salons, among them one with a purple sofa, when Granouilla, no longer Granouilla the Great, but only the quite private Granouilla, or simply dear little Jean Baptiste, would recover from the labors of the day. The castle's private rooms, however, were shelved from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves were all the odors that Granouilla had collected in the course of his life, several million of them, and in the castle's cellars the best scents of his life were stored in casks. When properly aged, they were drawn off into bottles that lay in miles of damp, cool corridors, and were arranged by vintage and estate. There were so many that they could not all be drunk in a single lifetime. Once dear little Jean Baptiste had finally returned chez soi, I think that's pronounced, lying on his simple, cozy sofa in his purple salon, his boots finally pulled off, so to speak. He clapped his hands and called his servants, who were invisible, intangible, inaudible, and above all, inodorous, and thus totally imaginary servants, and ordered them to go to the private rooms and get this or that volume from the great library of odors, and to the cellars to fetch something for him to drink. The imaginary servants hurried off, and Granouilla's stomach cramped in tormented expectation. He suddenly felt like a drunkard who is afraid that the shot of brandy he has ordered at the bar will, for some reason or other, be denied him. What if the cellar or the library were suddenly empty? If the wine in the casks had gone sour? Why were they keeping him waiting? Why did they not come? He needed the stuff now. He needed it desperately. He was addicted. He would die on the spot if he did not get it. Calm yourself, John Baptiste. Calm yourself, my friend. They're coming. They're coming. They're bringing what you crave. The servants are winging their way here with it. They are carrying the book of odors on an invisible tray, and in their white-gloved, invisible hands they are carrying those precious bottles. They set them down, ever so carefully. They bow, and they disappear. And then, left alone at last, once again, left alone, Jean Baptiste reaches for the odors he craves, opens the first bottle, pours a glass full to the rim, puts it to his lips, and drinks the glass of cool scent down in one draught, and it is luscious. It is so refreshingly good that dear John Baptiste's eyes fill with tears of bliss, and he immediately pours himself a second glass. A scent from the year 1752, sniffed up in spring, before sunrise on the Pont Royal, his nose directed to the west, from where a light breeze bore the blended odors of sea and forest and a touch of the tarry smell of the barges tied up at the bank. It was the scent from the end of his first night, spent roaming about Paris without Grimal's permission. It was the fresh odor of the approaching day, of the first daybreak that he had ever known in freedom. That odor had been the pledge of freedom. It had been the pledge of a different life. The odor of that morning was for Granua the odor of hope. He guarded it carefully, and he drank of it daily. Once he had emptied the second glass, all his nervousness, all his doubt and insecurity fell away from him, and he was filled with glorious contentment. He pressed his back against the soft cushions of his sofa, opened a book, and began to read from his memoirs. He read about the odors of his childhood, of his school days, about the odors of the broad streets and hidden nooks of the city, about human odors, and a pleasant shudder washed over him, for the odors he now called up were indeed those that he despised, that he had exterminated. With sickened interest, Granua read from the book of revolting odors, and when his disgust outweighed his interest, he simply slammed the book shut, laid it aside, and picked up another. All the while he drank without pause from his noble sense. After the bottle of hope, he uncorked one from the year 1744, filled with the warm scent of the wood outside Madame Gaillard's house, and after that he drank a bottle of the scent of a summer evening, imbued with perfume and heavy with blossoms, gleaned from the edge of a park in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. I don't know how to say these French words. Dated 1753. He was now scent logged. His arms and legs grew heavier and heavier as they pressed into the cushions. His mind was wonderfully fogged, but it was not yet the end of his debauch. His eyes could read no more. True, the book had long since fallen from his hand, but he did not want to call an end to the evening without having emptied one last bottle, the most splendid of all, the scent of the girl from the Rue des Marais. He drank it reverently, and he sat upright on the sofa to do so, although that was difficult, and the purple salon whirled and swayed with every move. I believe this is the girl he murdered. Like a schoolboy, his knees pressed together, his feet side by side, his left hand resting on his left thigh. That was how little Granua drank the most precious scent from the cellars of his heart, glass after glass, and grew sadder and sadder as he drank. He knew that he was drinking too much. He knew that he could not handle so much good scent. And yet he drank till the bottle was empty. He walked along the dark passage from the street into the rear courtyard. He made for the glow of light. The girl was sitting there, pitting yellow plums. Far in the distance, the rockets and petards of the fireworks were booming. He put the glass down and sat there for a while yet, several minutes, stiff with sentimentality and guzzling, until the last aftertaste had vanished from his palate. He stared vacantly ahead. His head was suddenly as empty as the bottle. Then he toppled sideways onto the purple sofa, and from one moment to the next sank into a numbed sleep. At the same time, the other Granua fell asleep on his horse blanket, and his sleep was just as fathomless as that of the innermost Granua. For the Herculean deeds and excesses of the one had more than exhausted the other. They were, after all, one and the same person. When he awoke, however, he did not awaken in the purple salon of his purple castle, behind the seven walls, nor upon the vernal fields of scent within his soul, but most decidedly in his stony dungeon at the end of a tunnel, on hard ground, in the dark. And he was nauseated with hunger and thirst, and as chilled and miserable as a drunkard after a night of carousing. He crept on all fours out of his tunnel. Outside it would be some time of day or another, usually toward the beginning or end of night, but even at midnight the brightness of the starlight pricked his eyes like needles. The air seemed dusty to him, acrid, searing his lungs. The landscape was brittle. He bumped against the stones, and even the most delicate odors came sharp and caustic into a nose unaccustomed to the world. Granua the tick had grown as touchy as a hermit crab. that has left its shell to wander naked through the sea. He went to his watering spot, licked the moisture from the wall for an hour, for two. It was pure torture. Time would not end, time in which the real world scorched his skin. He ripped a few scraps of moss from the stones, choked them down, squatted, shitting as he ate. It must all be done quickly, quickly, quickly. And as if he were a hunted creature, a little soft-fleshed animal, and the hawks were already circling the sky overhead, he ran back to his cave to the end of the tunnel where his horse blanket was spread. There he was safe at last. He leaned back against the stony debris, stretched out his legs, and waited. He had to hold his body very still, like some vessel about to slosh over from too much motion. Gradually, he managed to gain control of his breathing. His excited heart beat more steadily. The pounding of the waves inside him subsided slowly, and suddenly solitude fell across his heart like a dusky reflection. He closed his eyes. The dark doors within him opened, and he entered the next performance in the theater of Grenouille's soul. The next performance in the theater of Grenouille's soul was beginning. 28. I need a drink, though. Look at that foam's good. That's power. And so it went, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. So it went for 7 long years. Meanwhile, war raged in the world outside, a world war. Men fought in Silesia and Saxony and Hanover and the Low Countries, in Bohemia and Pomerania. The king's troops died in Hesse and Westphalia, and the Balearic Islands in India, on the Mississippi, and in Canada. If they had not already succumbed to typhoid on the journey, the war robbed 1 million people of their lives, France of its colonial empire, and all the warring nations of so much money that they finally decided with heavy hearts to end it. One winter during this period, Grenouille almost froze to death without even noticing it. For 5 days he lay in his purple salon, and when he awoke in his tunnel, he was so cold he could not move. He closed his eyes again and would have slept himself to death, but then the weather turned around. There was a thaw, and he was saved. Once the snow was so deep that he did not have the strength to burrow down to the lichen. He fed himself on the stiff carcasses of frozen bats. What? Once a dead raven lay at the mouth of the cave. He ate it. These were the only events in the outside world of which he took notice for 7 years. Otherwise, he lived only within his mountain, only within the self-made empire of his soul, and he would have remained there until his death, since he lacked for nothing if catastrophe had not struck, driving him from his mountain, vomiting him back out into the world. Let's get some more beer. That's a fucking beer, buddy. Dirty bastard. See how long this next chapter is? Oh, that's going to be a long one. What's that, 38? 5 pages, not too long. We shall read that. That will suffice for one night. The catastrophe was not an earthquake, not a forest fire, not an avalanche, not a cave-in. It was not an external catastrophe at all, but an internal one, and as such particularly distressing because it blocked Grenouille's favorite means of escape. It happened in his sleep, or better, in his dreams, or better still, in a dream while he slept in the heart of his fantasies. He lay on his sofa in the purple salon and slept. the empty bottles all about him. He had drunk an enormous amount with 2 whole bottles of the scent of the red haired girl for a nightcap. Apparently, it had been too much for his sleep, though deep as death itself was not dreamless this time, but threaded with ghostly wisps of dreams. These wisps were clearly recognizable as scraps of odors. At first, they merely floated in thin threads past Granuia's nose, but then they grew thicker, more cloud like, and now it seemed as if he were standing in the middle of a moor from which fog was rising. The fog slowly climbed higher. Soon, Granuia was completely wrapped in fog, saturated with fog, and it seemed he could not get his breath for the foggy vapor. If he did not want to suffocate, he would have to breathe the fog in. And the fog was, as noted, an odor, and Granuia knew what kind of odor. The fog was his own odor. His, Granuia's, own body odor was the fog. And the awful thing was that Granuia, although he knew that this odor was his odor, could not smell it. Virtually drowning in himself, he could not for the life of him, smell himself. As this became clear to him, he gave a scream as dreadful and loud as if he were being burned alive. The scream smashed through the walls of the purple salon, through the walls of the castle, and sped away from his heart, across the ditches and swamps and deserts, hurtled across the nocturnal landscape of his soul like a firestorm, howled its way out of his mouth down the winding tunnel, out into the world, and far across the high plains of Sanfleur. I'm guessing it's flower or fleur, as if the mountain itself were screaming. And Granui awoke at his own scream. In waking, he thrashed about as if he had to drive off the odorless fog trying to suffocate him. He was deathly afraid. His whole body shook with the raw fear of death. Had his scream not ripped open the fog, he would have drowned in himself. A gruesome death. He shuddered as he recalled it, and as he sat there shivering and trying to gather his confused, terrified thoughts, he knew one thing for sure. He would change his life, if only because he did not want to dream such a frightening dream a second time. He would not survive it a second time. He threw his horse blanket over his shoulders and crept out into the open. It was already morning outside, a late February morning. The sun was shining. The earth smelled of moist stones, moss, and water. On the wind there already lay a light bouquet of anemones, sorry. He squatted on the ground before his cave. The sunlight warmed him. He breathed in the fresh air. Whenever he thought of the fog that he had escaped, a shudder would pass over him, and he shuddered too from the pleasure of the warmth he felt on his back. It was good, really, that this external world still existed, if only as a place of refuge. Nor could he bear the awful thought of how it would have been not to find a world at the entrance to the tunnel. No light, no odor, no nothing. Only the ghastly fog inside, outside, everywhere. Gradually the shock subsided. Gradually the grip of anxiety loosened, and Granuia began to feel safer. Toward noon, he was his old, cold-blooded self. He laid the index and middle fingers of his left hand under his nose and breathed along the backs of his fingers. He smelled the moist spring air spiced with anemones. He did not smell anything of his fingers. He turned his hand over and sniffed at the palm. He sensed the warmth of his hand but smelled nothing. Then he rolled up the ragged sleeve of his shirt, buried his nose. Whoa, what the fuck? Buried his nose in the crook of his elbow. He knew that this was the spot where all humans smell like themselves, but he could smell nothing. He could not smell anything in his armpits, nor on his feet, nor around his genitals, when he bent down to them as far as he possibly could. It was grotesque. He, Granua, who could smell other people miles away, was incapable of smelling his own genitals not a handspan away. Nevertheless, he did not panic, but considered it all coolly, and spoke to himself as follows: "It is not that I do not smell, for everything smells. It is rather that I cannot smell that I smell, because I have smelled myself day in, day out since my birth, and my nose is therefore dulled against my own smell. If I could separate my own smell, or at least a part of it, from me, and then return to it after being weaned from it for a while, then I would most certainly be able to smell it, and therefore me." He laid the horse blanket aside and took off his clothes, or at least what remained of them. Rags and tatters were what he took off. For 7 years he had not removed them from his body. They had to be fully saturated with his own odor. He tossed them into a pile at the cave entrance and walked away. Then, for the first time in 7 years, he once again climbed to the top of the mountain. There he stood, on the same spot where he had stood on the day of his arrival, held his nose to the west, and let the wind whistle around his naked body. His intention was thoroughly to air himself, to be pumped so full of the west wind, and that meant with the odor of the sea and wet meadows, that his odor would counterbalance his own body odor, creating a gradient of odors between himself and his clothes, which he would then be in a position to smell. And to prevent his nose from taking it to the least bit of his own odor, he bent his body forward, stretching his neck out as far as he could against the wind. With his arms stretched behind him, he looked like a swimmer just before he dives into the water. He held this totally ridiculous pose for several hours, and even by such pale sunlight, his skin, maggot white from lack of sun, was turned a lobster red. Toward evening, he climbed back down to the cave. From far off, he could see his clothes lying in a pile. The last few yards he held his nose closed and opened it again only when he had lowered it right down onto the pile. He made the sniffing test he had learned from Baldini, snatching up the air and then letting it out to form a bell around his clothes, with his nose stuck into it as the clapper. He did everything possible to extract his own odor from his clothes. But there was no odor in them. It was most definitely not there. There were 1,000 other odors: the odor of stone, sand, moss, resin, raven's blood, even the odor of the sausage that he had bought years before near Sully was clearly perceptible. Those clothes contained an olfactory diary of his last 7, 8 years. Only one odor was not there: his own odor. The odor of the person who had worn them continuously all the time. That time. And now he began to be truly alarmed. The sun had set. He was standing naked at the entrance to the tunnel, where he had lived in darkness for 7 years. The wind blew cold, and he was freezing, but he did not notice that he was freezing, for within him was a counterfrost. Fear. What the fuck is a counterfrost? It was not the same fear that he had felt in his dream, the ghastly fear of suffocating on himself, which he had to shake off and flee, whatever the cost. What he now felt was the fear of not knowing much of anything about himself. It was the opposite pole of that other fear. He could not flee it, but had to move toward it. He had to know for certain, even if that knowledge proved too terrible, whether he had an odor or not, and he had to know now, at once. He went back into the tunnel. Within a few yards he was fully engulfed in darkness, but he found his way as if by brightest daylight. He had gone down this path many thousands of times, knew every step and every turn, could smell every low-hanging jut of rock and every tiny protruding stone. It was not hard to find the way. What was hard was fighting back the memory of the claustrophobic dream, rising higher and higher within him like a flood tide with every step he took. But he was brave, that is to say, he fought the fear of knowing with the fear of not knowing, and he won the battle because he knew he had no choice. When he had reached the end of the tunnel, there were the rock slides there where the rock slides slanted upwards. Both fears fell away from him. He felt calm, his mind was quite clear, and his nose sharp as a scalpel. He squatted down, laid his hands over his eyes, and smelled. Here on this spot, in this remote stony grave, he had lain for 7 years. There must be some smell of him here, if anywhere in this world. He breathed slowly. He analyzed exactly. He allowed himself time to come to a judgment. He squatted there for a quarter of an hour. His memory was infallible, and he knew precisely how this spot had smelled 7 years before. Stony and moist, salty, cool, and so pure that no living creature, man or beast, could ever have entered the place, which was exactly how it smelled now. He continued to squat there for a while, quite calm, simply nodding his head gently. Then he turned around and walked, at first hunched down, but when the height of the tunnel allowed it, erect out into the open air. Outside, he pulled on his rags. His shoes had rotted off him years before. Threw the horse blanket over his shoulders, and that same night left the Plum du Cantal, heading south. And I'm going to stop there just because I'm not reading 7 or 8 pages. That's a lot of pages. All right, brubs, that's all. Let me take another drink of the beer. All right, brubs, that's all. Guten Abend.